Princes and Priests. Chapter 4. Orc Blood. The long rest at the pond was good for everyone, Oirion thought. It had at least given them some space from each other, and even though the night was chilly, it was far warmer than in the cave on the coast. Although it was still summer in Awans, on this continent the coolness of autumn was noticeable. Not only that, what happened at the pond had also taught Ivan a bit of humility and showed the group that they were prepared to fight for each other. It also showed that Dave was fast on his feet and Shannon was stronger than he looked, but then Pertons always were famous for their muscular strength. For the most part, the group was asleep. Shannon wasn't. He never seemed to sleep. He sat combing his very long hair with his fingers. It was dry now, but he was still trying to get it smooth. It seemed a losing battle. His hair was a vanity, Oirion thought. Loose, it hung down beyond his waist. The ends were blonde, growing darker and turning red, blending into black from his shoulders to the roots. It would appear red at a distance, but when he had it pulled back into the typical braid, it looked completely black. Cindy, Ivan, and Raven were still out and about, but the rest slept. Oirion pretended that he didn't see Shannon. He'd have to say something to the man if he did. He wasn't sure how he felt about having his life saved by the Perton. He decided to forget it. No doubt they'd all owe each other before the end of this nightmare. He lay back, feeling comfortably tired after the sparring. It had helped, and maybe he would be able to get some sleep tonight. Raven returned, dropping down beside Oirion, silent in his approach.
"Ivan and Cindy coming in?"
Oirion asked, assuming Raven had given both a talking to about manners.
"They are on the way,"
Raven almost growled.
"What have they been doing? It's been hours."
"Each other,"
Raven grumbled.
"I've never met a more selfish pair of—"
He let it trail off. Oirion was a little surprised at the thought that Raven had not stopped them.
"She's married,"
he breathed, almost as upset by the fact that he wasn't surprised at her as by the fact that she had committed adultery.
"Apparently she doesn't care, and I don't think Ivan knows what that even means."
"And you let them,"
Oirion whispered back.
"I was distracted with other things until they were already busy."
He looked over at Oirion.
"There's orcs in these mountains, and something else that's close, but it moves a bit different. A warped counterpart, I suspect. I don't think we need to worry about attack, but one of us should take a watch."
As they spoke, Cindy came into the camp and crept over to where Theo lay. Oirion saw the young man's eyes open as his wife lay down against his back. Theo stared at the little fire. He didn't move, but he was awake, and the two priests knew it, even if Cindy didn't. Ivan came in from the other side of camp. He dropped down and used his blanket as a pillow, hands folded behind his head and brandishing a content smile.
"I'll take first watch,"
Raven said, his annoyance strong in his tone.
"I'm not sure I can sleep yet."
Theo was awake well before Cindy. He took his and Revan's blankets when he got up, leaving her with just one. Snatching his pack up, he joined Oirion and Travis at the fire. Kneeling, he dug in the pack, looking for something to use as a brooch to pin his blanket around his shoulders like a cloak. Unable to find anything, he just settled by the fire. Mist curled up off the pond. It was light out, but the sun had not yet risen. Theo watched Travis poking at the fire a bit, and then reached over to show the boy how to write "hi" in Awans. Travis looked over at Theo, who smiled and waved, attempting to explain the word's meaning. Travis smiled and wrote it back.
"Sleep all right?"
Oirion asked the thin young man. Theo looked up and shrugged.
"I suppose you can only sleep so well on the ground."
"Long enough and you'll get used to it."
Oirion offered what comfort he could.
"Do this long enough and beds won't feel right."
Oirion tried to smile. Theo nodded but didn't say anything. He looked back to the deaf boy, wrote Travis in the dirt with a little stick, and then pointed to the boy's chest. Theo and Travis looked up when Shannon joined them at the fire. He had several bundles of herbs that he handed to Oirion.
"Try those,"
he ordered Oirion. Then he dropped a little purse down into Travis's hand and walked away. Travis opened it and smiled. It was full of berries, which he happily shared with Theo. Oirion knelt with the herbs. He ran the bundles through his fingers. It didn't take much to dry the herbs. He did it all the time for Jamie, as he was better at it. One of the things he was better at. The irony was that it was a healer's task. Once the bundles were dry, he wrapped them in a silk sash made from a piece of Cindy's dress that he had salvaged. He laid them aside and accepted a few sweet berries from the boy, who offered them with a smile and put them in Orion's mouth, then hugged him before going back to Theo. Breakfast was leftover fish and nothing else. He handed the wrap back to Shannon, expecting at least a thank you or some note on how well done it was. Shannon merely handed them to Tavia, without so much as a word. Once they had eaten the little bit of fish, Raven and Oirion went to the side and knelt together. The two put their hands out, palms up, and closed their eyes. They sank into a trance and began a mutual scan, using each other's power to try to see more clearly. Shannon watched from a distance, while Dave made a point not to. Travis stood up to see better, hopping from one foot to the other as if he wanted to join them. Nothing seemed to happen, but both men rose a bit tired and very thirsty. Once they had recovered and the others were ready, Revan took the lead again. They headed up a trail that Revan had found earlier, hoping that it led over the ridgeline ahead of them. All the humans that they could detect were on the south side of the ridge. They stopped often, but for short rests only. It took Revan all day to find the pass. The faint trail wound up into the slope before them and seemed to vanish into the quickly approaching darkness.
"We will need to camp,"
Shannon said softly to Revan.
We should go back down the mountain a bit to camp deeper in the shelter of the trees,
Oirion said.
The wind will pick up and we don't have any tents. The others at least will need more shelter,
he argued with Shannon.
"We are still in the trees, Oirion,"
Shannon said, challenging Orion's attempt to give orders, contempt clear in his tone.
In the trees, right off a trail that is likely made by the locals,
Oirion said, irritation thick in his tone.
I've gotten close enough to them. I would really rather not meet more of them out of stupidity.
Shannon was annoyed, and it showed.
There's a cave up there.
Theo said softly to Dave, nodding up the mountain.
Do you see it?
Let's go up.
Dave stepped up with the information Theo had whispered to him. He strode between the two men who faced each other. Theo hurried to chase after Dave, and so broke the argument by also walking between Oirion and Shannon to follow the young man. Theo caught up with Dave at the foot of the boulders before the opening, the others following close behind. Raven gestured to Kelly, who took up the far side. The two warriors then moved up past the others and silently into the mouth of the cave, vanishing. There was a short scuffle from inside. Kelly appeared.
Clear,
She said, and went back in. Oirion strode up past Dave and Theo to get to the cave. The cave was larger than they would have thought and had a little maze of rooms in it. The smell was horrid, but it was dry. Kelly carried the former resident out of the back room. It was a small, green-skinned hobgoblin wearing bits and pieces of clothes that were obviously mismatched. Holding it by the back of its belt, Kelly carried it out of the cave past the others. Cindy gasped and covered her mouth. She whimpered and crowded closer to Theo. Shannon stepped back as Kelly passed. He started toward the door, but changed his mind and strode back down the mountain. The back room was heaped with the loot of the hobgoblin's victims. Raven began sorting through the pile for anything burnable or usable. Ivan moved to join him, but Tavia blocked the man's path.
leave it for the priest.
She said.
Why don't you go and get us wood for a fire?
He glared down at her.
I'll help,
Cindy offered happily. Ivan relented and followed Cindy out of the cave. Raven looked after them a moment, then muttered in Dwarven as he returned to sorting the pile. Dave ran for the door, gagging when he found a little side room and the source of the reek. Hung from the walls were bits and pieces of human bodies. The bones were all far too small to be even close to adult, and one was a complete skeleton. It was bound up by its ankles, its little dress still on. Theo went to untie the infant. He had tears in his eyes, but he was far from being as sick as Dave. It was not the first time he had dealt with things as sickening as this. Oirion caught up a little blanket from the pile that Raven was tossing to be burned and wrapped the baby's remains in it. Theo took it outside, while Oirion gathered up the rest of the bits and pieces, flesh that had been smoked and dried, and bones that were cracked and sucked clean. Raven had to stop twice, holding the back of his hand to his mouth, as Theo and Oirion cleaned the hobgoblin's pantry. The others found additional chores to do, and tried not to think about what that thing had done in this cave. Theo gathered the collection into the tattered remains of blankets and set the whole mess off to the side. When Ivan and Cindy returned, both smiling and messy-haired, they all gathered at the pile beside the door of the cave. Raven tried to lead a prayer, but couldn't. He felt like he was going to vomit. Oirion lifted a hand and held it over the bodies of the small children. He whispered the prayer of the dead and prayed for the families that had lost them. Then he hit the mess with white fire, incinerating it all into ash. The whole process was done in the few blinks it took for his eyes to adjust to the light. Cindy stood picking a few sprigs of evergreen out of her hair. She looked at Theo and lost her smile. He was not at all amused with her.
What? I fell.
She defended. Theo didn't even twitch. He was furious and holding it in. The young woman actually stepped back a little from her husband's cold, hard look. He turned and headed down the slope.
Theo,
Dave called.
where are you going?
I need to wash my hands.
Theo said back angrily, not turning and not slowing. Oirion moved to follow him while Raven went back inside to bless and cleanse the cave and the air in it as best he could. It would take a bit, but it would be safe for a time, and it wouldn't be inhabited by hobgoblins for a while.
What?
Ivan asked Dave with a shrug and a smile as the others went in.
If he was man enough, she wouldn't need me.
Dave shook his head.
Ivan, she's married to a comrade. Don't you have any morals at all?
Ivan laughed.
Theo, a boy like that doesn't deserve to have a woman while the rest of us don't. It's a woman's right to choose the best man in the crowd. If he was worth his piss, he would fight for her.
You're 3 times his size.
Dave objected.
Exactly,
Ivan said with a grin, and then ducked into the cave after the others. Dave looked off down the mountain at Theo and Oirion, their forms vanishing into the dark. Dave's life often depended on reading people, and he had a feeling about Theo. It seemed to Dave that Theo was not one who was easily angered, but that once he was, he'd be dangerous. As he turned to go back into the cave to help clean up, Dave saw his uncle standing in the dark and joined him, looking down at the two who were retreating.
He's more than he seems, isn't he?
Dave asked Shannon. The tall Purton looked over at Dave. The last bit of light reflected off the ice blue of his eyes, making him look rather eerie, as if his eyes had an inner light. Not all Purton's eyes did that, but Dave had seen his father's do it as well. It would scare the hell out of his crew when his anger reflected in his eyes. Men tended to die at that point.
Not all men reflect their power in their eyes,
Shannon said, and then turned and moved off, like a silent ghost down the slope, following the other 2 men. Dave waited a moment, and then went in to see if Tavia needed any help with the fire. In the rubble, Raven found very little of use or interest to them. There were a few bits of broken tools, the ratty clothes and fabrics used to make the nest, and rusted oddments. There were, however, a few things that were out of place. There was a helmet made of silver with a fine spine along the top, etched in gold. It was covered in 1,000 or more razor-thin slashes. The chin strap was gone, and along the edge of the helm was a band of metal that once had a layer of material, probably leather, over it. That material was also gone, leaving a row of slightly unpolished silver-headed rivets along the edge. There was an amulet made of some sort of tarnished metal. It held a dull stone that looked rather like a smooth piece of granite, but was far too light. The other thing he found of interest was a belt. It was very slender, made of discs of silver. Each disc had 3 squared rays of the sun off the sides, interlocking the discs as it tightened. The buckle was a full sun with a gold inlay of some detailed spell circle. It was nothing like Raven had ever seen. It was pretty and clearly expensive. The belt, like the helm, was covered in the fine slashes.
Dave?
He invited the young man to come and look at the finds. As a man of the waters, he might at least know the origin of the things. Dave moved to kneel in the firelight beside the dwarf and took a look at the goods. He had no idea about any of it. He turned as Shannon entered the room, followed by Oirion and Theo, and handed the helm up to him.
What do you make of that?
Dave asked him. Shannon took the helm and turned it in his gloved hands.
It is pre-imperial,
He said, slightly raising an eyebrow.
very old.
What empire?
Tavia asked, suddenly very interested.
Pertin.
Shannon said, glancing up.
How do you know that?
Ivan leaned up, getting a better look at it.
It is made of blue silver.
Shannon said.
The art of its crafting was lost in the Elder War.
He ran his fingers around the band.
The grass has been slicing at it for some time, but the original magic lingers.
He turned it and handed it back to Revan.
I think perhaps since I am the warrior here out front, I should have need of a helm.
Ivan said. The others all looked at him a moment without saying anything.
It's too small for you, Ivan.
Tavia said.
Your head is way too big.
She said it with a straight face, but Kelly smirked, and Dave had to cough politely to hide a smile.
What sort of magic is in it?
Kelly asked.
It might be restored and used to aid one of us in our travels, and it would be more easily decided who is to have it if we know what magic it possesses.
I would say the only use it has now is as a helm.
Shannon responded.
The magic is too degraded by the grass tearing at it for the last few thousand years for it to be of any other use.
So who should get it?
Tavia asked. There was silence in the group.
Do not look at me,
Shannon said.
I do not want it, and no matter what I say, Oirion will argue with it, so ask him.
He walked over and took a seat at the back of the little room. Oirion considered it and then nodded.
Maybe, Revan, you should wear it,
he said. Revan set the helm aside and tossed the amulet to Shannon. The man in black held it and turned it in his hands. He smiled faintly and then tossed it to Dave.
Recognize that?
Dave turned it in his hands and studied it for several minutes, desperately searching his brain to know what it was. Simply giving up on an answer to Shannon was nothing he was about to do. Just when he was certain that he had no idea, it came to him. He looked up at the Pertin, who was giving him a funny little crook of his head in his measure of a smile.
How the hell did this get here?
Dave queried.
It has been here a long time, and the grass has stripped it clean, but it predates the barrier.
What is it?
Cindy asked.
It's sort of ugly looking.
It's an amulet of the priesthood of the Vons.
Dave said, smoothing the worn, tarnished metal.
It's very old.
Priesthood of the Vons?
Cindy laughed.
The Vons aren't gods. They're just men.
Not the House of Von.
Kelly said.
The Vons, the angels who saved us from the Elder War, the Great War, and built the Empire. Armand, the Great One who served and protected the Pertins, who built the power keys of Ulambak and Amen-Ra, was the father of the line of the house. His daughter was the first empress of Port. And the Vons are more than just men. They are the descendants of the Vons, the angels. In the elder days, the Vons were prayed to for help and guidance. Some still are, as gods. There is no difference between the angels of Pert and the gods of the rest of the world. It's all just in how the race honors them and what name they use.
They all looked at Kelly silently for a moment, unsure of what to say. Dave tossed the amulet to her. No one objected. Revan handed Shannon the belt. He looked it over a bit.
It is blue silver as well.
He tossed the belt to Tavia.
And the spells are less corrupted on it. The belt was made to defend itself. It is also made to be worn by a woman.
I'm a woman.
Cindy objected.
Why does Tavia get it?
Because she's not a bitch.
Theo said under his breath. Dave fought a smile, bowing his head.
What did you say?
Ivan demanded. Theo looked up at the man.
Because she's not rich.
Kelly said.
If you think she needs a pretty belt, why don't you give her yours?
Theo said to Ivan, his tone flat.
If you're man enough to have a wife,
Cindy said, standing up angrily.
you would try to get me pretty things.
Shannon held up a hand to stop Tavia from giving the belt to Cindy.
You have more pretty things than you can wear in a lifetime.
Theo said angrily.
You let him ruin my dress. You don't try to please me. And now you let a peasant woman have a belt that I wish to have.
She said in Awans, her voice rising in pitch and volume. Theo looked at her, unimpressed.
I'm so sending you to Voldane,
he muttered in Imperial Pertin. Dave looked over at him, a bit startled. Voldane was a palace off the coast of Awans, on its own island, built to house the insane kings. The Lord household had one of those crop up every few generations.
What?
She shrieked.
Don't you dare try and talk to me in that language, Theo.
She spat his name.
If you have something to say, be man enough and say it.
Theo was all but twitching with anger as he looked at her.
It's a belt, Cynthia.
He snapped back.
And she is the one cooking and you haven't done a damn thing to help anyone. So enough.
I am not a peasant and I don't see you helping Mr. High and Mighty.
That will be enough,
Ravon said, his patience worn out.
Sit and say no more on the matter. If you don't like the decision, then complain to Shannon. He made it.
She turned to look at the man in black, ready to scream at him, but fell silent.
Wise girl,
Shannon said softly, a bit amused at her sudden lack of fight. She sat slowly, letting it go. Theo stared at the fire and pulled his blanket up, as if trying to vanish. The meal was bits of roots that Ravon had found and boiled up. It was bland and bitter. Shannon accepted none of it and left as they ate. He returned shortly thereafter with a few sprigs of herbs. As usual, he gave them to Tavia to make the tea. The tea was far better than the mashed root and was all Shannon took. Cindy ended up crying about the root tasting too horrid and that the tea had no honey. They all ignored her as they drank the tea. Without comment, they sank into their beds to try to get some sleep. Cindy went to Theo and curled in under his blanket with him. She wanted to be warm, and she wanted to be sure she had control over him. Her hand found his skin, and he was just too tired to fight her. She even tried to be quiet and discreet about it. After she fell asleep, he slid away from her and went outside. He made it a ways over the boulders and away from the cave, and then vomited. He tried not to cry, scared someone might be worried that he was hurt and follow him out. He hugged his arms against the cold and wished something would jump out of the dark and eat him. Just end it. He had hoped that he would not have to deal with Cindy much, but he knew now that was not to be the case. She would scream until he let her into his bedroom, and the moment he failed to please her, she would use rumors of his lack of interest in women to control him. He had married the girl because he felt obligated to marry, and she was as good as any. Sometimes her abuse of him made her touch feel almost as foul as his mother's. At least Cindy was just selfish, not evil. It was an unfair comparison, he knew, but knowing didn't change how he felt. As he stood there in the dark, it started to snow. This far north, winter came early. Theo wiped his mouth and then headed back, shivering and sniffing, as much from the cold as anything. Shannon was outside the cave, holding a blanket. He put it around Theo's shoulders, engulfing him in warmth.
You shouldn't wander alone,
Shannon said.
Why not? I might get killed.
Theo half laughed.
I wouldn't be so lucky, but thanks,
he said, and then ducked back in. He didn't sleep next to his wife. He found a spot as far from her as he could. He'd rather sleep with a hobgoblin right now. The snow continued to fall during the night. When they woke, the ground was covered in a foot-thick cold white blanket. Shannon had already gone hunting and returned with a small deer of some sort. They boiled it for breakfast, and Oirion dried some into jerky strips using basic magics of his order. The dried meat was split up between them, all except for Shannon, who again refused food. Once they had eaten, they packed up and took time to turn their blankets into cloaks. Ravon pushed the helm onto his head and then moved out of the cave into the cold morning. He had to hunt to find the trail under the snow. A chill breeze cut through their clothes as they left their shelter to follow the dwarf. It was a hard hike all day as the trail twisted up the mountain. It only began to wind downward out of the bitter cold as the sun went behind a bank of clouds on the western horizon. The day left most of them bruised and sore. It was dark as they reached the lower slopes and the tree line. They were still in the snow and had to find a shelter soon. Ravon spotted a great tree with spreading boughs, its massive branches seeming sufficient to hold out the snow and the wind. They were all freezing cold, hurting from the snow and wanting to just get out of it and rest, but Cindy was the only one whimpering about it.
That tree isn't right,
Theo whispered to no one as he stood looking at it.
Shannon,
Dave said, overhearing. He waited for Shannon to reach them.
what do you think of this tree?
He asked. The tree was far larger than any other around it, dominating the hillside. Shannon looked at it for a moment.
We cannot camp here,
he said. Oirion looked back at him as he pulled the boughs apart to let the others in. The others quickly moved under the boughs to get out of the cold.
And why not?
Oirion demanded.
The tree is alive,
Shannon said.
Yes, I realize that.
Hey, we aren't the first to camp here.
Cindy said, delighted.
Look at the bones.
As she darted toward a pile of bones, the tree shivered and woke up. It began moving its limbs in an effort to trap them inside. The mood instantly shifted to alert. Cindy screamed. Revan yelled and shoved Kelly back out from under the tree as best he could. Cindy screamed again and tried to get out as the boughs grabbed at her. All those under the tree were grabbed up by the branches, like hands around kittens, trapping them in the writhing tree limbs. Ivan roared and tried to get to his sword, but his arms were already too tangled in the grip that held him. With a shout, Kelly grabbed the branch that held her and wrenched it hard, tearing herself the rest of the way free. She tore Travis free, dove clear of a sweeping attack, and rolled out over the snow. The tree whipped its branch around fast and tried to sink a limb down through her, but missed, piercing the ground hard like a giant spear. Revan punched the rough bark tentacle that had grabbed his leg and was holding him upside down. As the branch exploded with fire flaring up the limb, Revan was dropped. He rolled to one side and scrambled back to avoid two other limbs retaliating against his magical attack. Regaining his balance, he threw up his arms with a dwarven shout, creating a magic shield. As fast as the shield went up, it was hit so hard that Revan felt his wrist fracture, but the branch was stopped short, as if it had hit a dwarven shield of magic silver and bone. Oirion was swept back as he tried to get to Tavia. The force hit him hard, sending him rolling. He recovered quickly and threw a ball of fire at the tree's trunk. It hit the target dead center, like burning oil, and set the whole thing alight. The tree reeled back and dropped its victims. They gasped for air and struggled to escape. Shannon grabbed Travis, keeping him from running back to his mother. Kelly saw and moved to help the others, without having to worry about the whereabouts of the child. Dave ducked in past the dripping flames and thrashing limbs to rescue several packs that the others had shed in their effort to escape. The tree lashed out, flailing its burning boughs as the fire climbed up its giant body. Then it went still and burned like a torch in the night. It didn't crackle or pop as pine would, but released a black smoke that smelled more like fat than wood. Theo remained where he had been standing, a look of awe and shock on his face.
Did you see that?
He breathed.
Yeah, I think we did.
Dave panted, handing Ivan back his now scorched pack. They fell back in retreat, helping each other along the way. Quickly they left the area and went deeper into the forest with Shannon in the lead. He carried Travis, who clung to him, his face buried in Shannon's shoulder. Revan brought up the end, pushing Cindy along as she stumbled and sobbed for rest.
Keep moving,
he told her under his breath, pushing her forward again. They stopped at a great tree that had fallen over, creating a sort of shelter with its long dead branches and root mass. Shannon tucked the boy in under the massive trunk and went to cut fresh boughs from the nearest tree to form a more solid shelter. Revan and Dave moved to help him as Oirion knelt to make a fire. Ivan helped the women break branches clear so they could all easily climb in under the trunk without stabbing their heads on the broken limbs. They all crawled in to share warmth and to get out of the wind, which was picking up. Shannon gave them time to settle down, standing guard by the opening, then slipped away to go hunting for the morning. Shannon had found a meal, some sort of small rodent animals. They looked like squirrels, but he already had them skinned and ready to boil, so nobody could tell for sure. He also produced several little sprigs of herbs that he'd scavenged from the last bit of summer in the mountains. They didn't talk as they ate and tried to keep warm.
It'll be better below,
Revan said to the weary group.
Once we get moving, we'll drop off the ridge and warm up.
It was a hopeful incentive that got them all on their feet and trudging down the steep slope after him. Shannon took up the rear as Raven led them with a steady pace. They traveled most of the day, picking their way down into a gorge, following it until it began to climb toward another ridge. No one was up for another night like the one before, so Raven set to camp searching long before dark. He found a place that was open enough, set before an exposed chunk of stone that ascended like a solid wall behind them. They took the time to drag over enough logs to build a defensive front that would also block the wind, and settled down as quickly as possible. Raven and Shannon both left to go hunting for whatever food they could find. Oirion sat back against the wall, wishing Jamie was there. He could find things to eat. He could pull meals out of nothing with such ease, it made Oirion rather annoyed at times. Although Jamie lacked skills in many of the tasks of camp, he did what he could, while Oirion saw to sleeping arrangements, scans, and setting perimeters. On days like this, any help would be better than nothing, but most especially finding food. Cindy began to giggle as Ivan tickled her.
"Stop it!"
Oirion scolded Ivan.
What harmless fun!
Ivan said. Oirion was not in the mood.
"Just sit and be quiet. This area is not friendly."
He leaned his head back, wishing the big man would just lie down and go to sleep. They all hurt, and here he was wrestling with Cindy. Raven returned carrying some sort of animal. None of them could even guess at what it was. Suddenly, the dwarf drew up sharply and looked around, lifting his nose like that of a dog sniffing for a scent. He caught the scent again and confirmed it.
"Stay put and stay quiet,"
he said, and raced off up the mountain.
What is that?
Ivan asked, as the same smell reached him on the rising night breeze.
"Orc,"
Oirion said.
"Keep quiet."
Raven returned shortly, and without comment dropped to the fire, and began to cut up the unidentified animal, obviously unconcerned about the orc.
"It was only a lone youth. It was no threat to us,"
he told Oirion as Shannon returned. Shannon knelt by Tavia and unfolded a corner of his surcoat full of apples, old and a bit withered, but apples nonetheless. He said nothing but left the camp at once. Orcs were no threat. An army of orcs could attack this group and still be no real threat. The dwarf underestimated the two big warriors and the powers within this group. Youth rarely saw past the immediate, and to Shannon, the dwarf was still young, even at 200. Shannon had hopes for Theo. Even Cindy had potential that the dwarf readily overlooked. Circumstance was often the only difference between women like Cindy and women like Kelly. No creature was more adaptable than a human woman. Shannon had seen the truth of that 1,000 times over. His thoughts, however, focused on other things. Fear was what Shannon could taste in the air. The other was blood magic. He followed them both now, silent in the woods, fleeting and fast. Mountains and forest were as much his home as they were to the dwarf. He moved quickly through them. Although Shannon could smell the juvenile's fear lingering farther down the mountain, the trail he followed wasn't that of the young orc. Its fading trail was moving away from what Shannon was tracking. The youth was nothing compared to what it was fleeing. Shannon followed the energy up the mountain and over a wooded ridge. The trail led down to a clearing. Torches lined the edge of the open space along the tree line, illuminating the area. A massive stone altar stood in the center. Shannon knew what it was long before he got there. It made him wonder what kept the two priests from sensing the real threat. Both of them should have felt it for hours now. He was mildly disappointed in them. Stopping, Shannon stood at the edge of the clearing to look over the local power. Let the dwarf worry about the campsites. Shannon needed to know what to hide them from. 5 wizards, none of them very powerful, were spaced around the altar. Several of them were chanting the weakest of the blood incantations, as the 6th member wildly raped a victim covered in a white cloth and bound to the altar. Everything was cheap, from their old stained robes to the candles they used, which barely stayed lit in the gusting wind. They had mixed elements that didn't even work together, causing their effects to counter each other, denying them any real power. The mistakes started at the very basic levels, with the blood spells on the side of the altar. Not one of them was right. The Shroud of Silence, or its childlike attempt, pinned on the woman with sharp needles through her skin, was woven improperly. It was nothing but a piece of cloth. 2 of the 13 candles around the circle's edge had actually gone out. The rudimentary demon seal spilled on the ground in black sand was broken from careless feet. It was utterly useless. They were left defenseless. Not only that, the men had poor pronunciation, were off rhythm, and not speaking in unison. Whoever had taught them was either very stupid or making sure they didn't achieve much. Shannon had seen it all before. It was typical of the rustic, untrained peasants desperate for power, but by far the worst attempt to gain it he'd ever seen. It was crude and unnecessary. He removed men like these and this sort of behavior in the rest of the world when they happened to cross his path. Normally, he would have moved in to kill them immediately and then cleaned up the evidence, both physical and magical. The cleric in him would not die. Despite it all, he still had that. There was a difference, something that kept him from doing so this time. The power that came from the victim was not human, but neither was it elven, nor dwarven, or even Pertan. It was far more animalistic, a power that he had never tasted before. As Shannon circled the scene, the man on the altar backed away. He was so giddy from his climax he fell to the dirt, destroying any last vestige of wards drawn in the sand. He was rolling on the ground, feeling the pleasure of the power rush that he had just stolen from his victim. Shannon was disgusted at their fumbling and annoyed at the energy they were spilling into the currents, negative energies that he would have to deal with. It was intolerable. Shannon stepped out of the trees and into the torchlight. These men would all die tonight, and Shannon would burn the area clean of them. As he approached, the power played off his shield. Its fingers tried to seduce him, like some sort of familiar lover tempting him to lie down and taste what he knew would be enjoyed. His shields held without strain, and his discipline did not waver. The balding man, who was at the head of the altar, grabbed the cloth that covered the woman. He ripped it away, tearing her flesh. Shannon actually stepped back in disgust. It was not human. She was an orc. The bloods around the table lunged in, finding the bleeding rips in her skin. Each began to drink in the blood and the energy that was in it. They were trying to provoke her to use power to stop them and, in turn, give them energy highs. It was a high that no drug could rival. With such incompetence, any of 1,000 accidents could happen, resulting in the foolish wizard's painful deaths. Their own destruction was low on the list of bad side effects. Of all the things he had seen, this ranked among the most disgusting. There was something very sickening about intelligent races sucking power and life from those barely more than animals. He could learn about these lands from the mind of one of them. That was all he needed, just one, and it would take only a moment to rip the information from the man's memory. He began to lift his hand, but stopped when the orc looked at him. The orc's eyes did not fit her body. There was intelligence and control there, not the animal hungers that ruled the orcs of the rest of the world. He stopped, a little impressed that she could even see him. The shields that he wore usually hid him from anyone who didn't already know he was there. The world overlooked him, yet she saw him.
Help me,
she pleaded telepathically. Shannon let the gathered power relax and approached the altar. The bloods were so preoccupied with their feast that even if they had the power to see him, they didn't. He walked around the foot of the altar, where the leader was still on the ground, moaning and limp with pleasure. Shannon stepped up onto the altar. He did not want any of the fools to bump into him. Standing over her, he looked down at her, considering her plea. He was drawn to her, his mind filled with 1,000 questions of how, why, and what. He watched her curiously, almost in disbelief that she could see him. Her dark eyes followed his every move. All the curiosities and the desire to learn that had lain dormant so long rose up. For a moment, he forgot everything else but the pursuit of understanding, the same pursuit that had filled a library with his writings and his studies. It had been many centuries since he'd even had his interest sparked in the least. She was orc, yes, but she was also part human. It was the human blood in her that began to prick at his shields and made the hunger buzz in the back of his head. Only thousands of years of hard work allowed him to get so close to so much power and blood, yet still remain in control of himself, let alone to be disassociated from it. She watched him, her own magics numbing her to the pain that would turn her blood into liquid power for those who fed on her. He was fascinated. All the orcs he had run into were far from mastering their powers to the level she was using. He used a whisper of his own magic to look deeper into her mind as he squatted down to examine her. His energy brushed against her, showing him what had created her. Her father had been a human blood, and she had been conceived in this same sort of ritual. It was likely that her mother and her mother's mother were part human as well. He wondered if she was self-taught, what society she belonged to, how old she was, and how she was able to be so calm about this. He had so many questions. He really didn't want to have to kill her. He began to consider the best way to get the information from her without leaving a mess, witnesses, or risking his identity. He was considering turning the bloods into ash and helping her up when she acted. With a burst of power, she snapped the chain that held her arms down. Her claws shot out of her knuckles, and she sank them into the side of Shannon's thigh. His leg almost buckled from the force of her punch alone. He cried out, as much in surprise as in pain, and grabbed her wrist to pry it away. He almost screamed as she stopped numbing herself, allowing the pain to flow through her own body, sending explosive power into him. She had bypassed his shields and went right into his bloodstream. In this manner, her pain, fear, and life became raw energy to him. His shield shredded from the inside out as he felt the power awaken the beast within. That part of him that he fought and hated but hungered for roared to life. The monster within himself was almost as quickly blown away by the energy that was sent to him, creating a state of euphoria more powerful than any drug. His body was washed with the pleasure. It came in waves so strong that for a moment his heart felt whole. His eyes rolled back and he was rigid and unable to move as blood and fiery pleasure coursed through his veins. She fed him information with her soul's energy. It came too fast for him to understand or care about. Some part of his mind still worked, desperately fighting the consuming pleasure that burned him from the inside out, threatening to destroy him and break him down to what he had been all those millennia ago. She was no stray catch. She was, at the very least, a master level in magic, and she was doing this all with the intention of creating an ambassador between races. She had no idea who or what he even was. He struck at her with his last bit of rational thought, almost frantic to stop her. The power that shot from his hand went at her in a blast of red light. She screamed as the flare consumed her, the force of it shredding her face. Blinding light shot out of the rips in her flesh and into the men who had attached themselves to her. They were hurled back, blood running from all the holes in their heads. They crumpled where they fell, some of them even charred about the mouth. Only the man who had been reeling from his earlier thrill was left alive. Silence followed. Shannon stood over the dead Orcan woman. The altar was cracked down the middle by his blast. The shields that had hid the ceremony were gone. Even from here he could taste the two priests, their emotions, the heartbeats of the small company lost in the mountains, and that of the man who stared at him in awe and fear. Shannon slowly got to his feet. He stood intoxicated by the power and pleasure of the encounter. The blood wizard, still on the ground behind Shannon, scrambled to make a break, running for the tree line. Shannon leapt from the altar, crossing the span of the clearing. He grabbed the man by the back of the robe and spun him around, pinning him against a tree, the man's fear too sweet to let escape. Shannon grabbed the man's groin, crushing it in his grip, adding pain to the sweet elixir of fear and blood power he was swimming in. Shannon shifted his hold on the man and crushed his face with an elbow strike, amplified with power. He absorbed one last gust of energy just before the man died. He turned away. There was a cleric close. The blood of a cleric would give him enough power to leave this continent instantly. The blood of a cleric could maybe heal his heart and allow him vengeance. The thought jarred him back out of the darkness. The cleric was Reven, and he was closing in. Catching his breath, tears on his cheeks, Shannon stepped back unsteadily.
"It's Reven,"
he whispered to himself.
"It's Reven."
Almost in a daze, he touched his leg. The blood that had run down his leather pants smeared onto his hand. He looked at his hand a moment. His leg almost gave out under his weight as he stepped back, moving away from the dead man at his feet. Fighting for control of his thoughts, he reached down and put his hand over the gash in his leg. Using the new power that was rushing through him, contaminating him and tainting his energies, he blocked the pain. He needed to use up some of the orc woman's power that was within him. It was poisoning him, tearing at his soul and his shields, threatening to rip it all away. It was a foul power, like having eaten rotten meat, making his stomach churn. Usually that didn't happen right away. Luckily, it wasn't enough to destroy him or the work he had put into his shields, but it was dangerously close. He could swallow it, use it to keep his leg from bleeding more, and to hold the leather of his pants closed. He could use it to burn the clearing, hiding all the truth from Reven, and escape unseen. The power and the sick energies would be burned up in a few hours, but the putrid taste would linger. The damage to the inside of his shields would take much longer to repair. She had no idea what she had almost done. His instincts were already resetting themselves to be more careful. He could not risk such an encounter again. Shannon was becoming ill so fast that he took only the time necessary to clear the circle and hide his arrival at it. It was still hours until dawn. He needed time and a drink of fresh water to recover. Water would help. Its inherent energy would cool and settle the power raging in him. It would sink into his body like a cool balm and bring him back down out of the high. He dropped gratefully beside a small creek that ran down the mountain, not too far from the clearing. He washed the blood from his gloves before scooping up water to sip at. The water sped the process of coming down from the high. Still, after all these years, this revolted him. He still cried every time and vomited until he was able to taste his own blood and bile in his mouth. He held himself tightly, shivering with a cold sweat. This time was no different. His soul came screaming up, and he fell to his knees and elbows with weakness and consuming grief. It still tore at his soul, what was left of it anyway. He no longer prayed as he once had. God didn't hear the prayers of the damned. Tears ran from his eyes, burning his cheeks, and his leg throbbed where he had been stabbed with the orc's claws. Holding his pounding head, he curled over and struggled to let the feeling pass, trying not to control what was happening. It never helped. It just made it that much harder, leaving him exhausted and feeling weak, inside and out. After all the years, all the centuries of this, he hadn't been able to escape it or accept it. This battle he fought was tearing at him, tearing at what was left of his soul and his sanity. He could feel his sanity slipping through his fingers as his soul was burned away a little more each time. He wanted to scream at Jerome for doing this to him, to scream at the church for allowing it to happen, at God for not helping him. But he had already. He had screamed until his throat was torn, his body weak, and no words were left unused. But it did no good. He hoped that he would be able to rebuild his shields well enough that the priests wouldn't see, smell, or taste this, and that he would be able to block them out in the temptation that they were to him. They were both powerful men, and they had the power that a vampire craves the most. It was the very power that was stolen from him. His heart ached for the energy of life that was amplified in a priest. His heart ached at the hollowness that had once been filled with the very same golden power that flowed through Reven and Oirion. He took another shuddering breath and tried to stay relaxed and let it happen. He pushed away any thought of the priests and tried to swallow more water.
"Where have you been?"
Oirion demanded as Shannon entered the clearing where they all rested. Oirion was on edge, jumpy for some reason other than the fact that he didn't trust Shannon. Instead of an answer, Shannon gave the priest a steady look and moved to the pack he had set down earlier. Oirion was dangerous. Now was not the time to get into a fight with the man. Oirion would go to war with Shannon if he even got a hint of what Shannon was. Knowing that, Shannon gave Oirion a wide berth. There was nothing about the night that he wanted to think about, let alone talk about, and sure as hell not to Oirion.
There is blood activity in the mountains. Where have you been, Shannon?
Oirion demanded, a bit more sternly. The rest of the camp began to stir as Orion's voice woke them. Shannon momentarily thought about telling Oirion the truth, and about how much easier his life would be once Oirion was dead at his feet. Oirion would attack him, and he would have no choice. The problem of Oirion ShaHaNon would be solved.
Do you think I did not sense that?
Shannon asked, barely keeping his annoyance out of his voice.
Reven went looking for you,
Oirion said.
And for the source.
Are you accusing him of something?
Dave asked.
No,
Oirion said after a moment, glancing at Dave.
Just pointing out that I don't like him vanishing on a whim and not telling anyone. These mountains aren't safe.
I am touched by your concern, Oirion,
Shannon said, as he lifted his canteen in a mock toast. Part of Shannon was impressed with Oirion and his ability to maintain without Jamie and in Shannon's company. Another part just wished the man would go away forever. Revan returned to the camp, looking a little tired and a bit disheveled.
We need to move now,
he said, picking up his pack. He looked at Oirion and switched to the old imperial language that was only taught or spoken by priests of the Sixth Kingdom anymore.
There are vampires in the mountains.
He left it at that. They both knew that, as they were weaponless and burdened with the group, they would be the next meal for any vampires around. The blood of two priests was nothing that would be passed up. Revan took the lead immediately, making them leave their little fortified camp without a meal or time to even fully wake up. They were moving before the sun rose, and the dwarf set a pace that left the slower members far behind. Shannon brought up the rear, letting the two clerics get farther ahead. The farther away they were, the better. When Tavia could no longer find their trail, she sat down with her son, letting him rest in her lap as she waited for the others to catch up to her. Cindy was the first to join her in the small clearing, dropping down close and wrapping her blanket tight to try to warm her thinly clad legs. After a few moments, Theo joined them and sat down, trying to catch his breath. Then Shannon entered the little clearing. Tavia looked up as the tall Purton walked up to where they were seated.
I lost their trail,
she said.
It is just as well,
Shannon answered.
Theo and I can go aside and catch some fish while you get a fire going. It might be a while.
He gestured Theo to follow him, and they left the trail they had been on, making their way through the trees. A small stream rolled and splashed along a twisting little bed. It was pretty, except for the fact that it had ice along the edges. Theo had the sinking feeling that he was going to be getting wet. He was already in pain, and cold water promised to only make it worse, but he said nothing. Shannon moved along the stream to choose a spot that he liked. He knelt, polished a smooth stone at the water's edge, and then looked up at Theo.
Pay attention. I am not going to show you this twice.
He gestured across the stream.
You want to find 2 stones that have a suitable spell surface.
He pointed to the smooth stone across the water.
You want the stones to reach into the water, preferably to the bottom. Ideally, you are below a small waterfall.
He motioned to the waterfall he had chosen.
You start with a rope spell.
He drew on the center of the stone with a sorcerer's spell. It created a cord of energy that served as a rope. Theo knew it well enough. It was very basic and used in a great many ways, but none of them very practical as far as Theo was concerned. He knelt and paid close attention as Shannon built a net of power across the stream. He doubled the net and allowed it to let things in, but not out. A fish could swim upstream or downstream into the trap, but not escape. That being done, Shannon then conjured up a very basic barrier spell. He made it small and started far upstream. He then slowly brought it down, pushing everything in the water down to his net. Theo watched, amazed and fascinated by the magic and the very useful application of it. Shannon showed him how to sort the things in the water, letting the undesired through the barrier, but keeping what he wanted. By the time the barrier reached the net below, All that was left were a dozen fish to choose from.
Those are warped negatively,
Shannon said, pointing at 3 of the fish, brightly striped with red bands. He pushed them back upstream through the barrier spell. That left a type of fish that looked rather like some sort of trout, but was speckled with leaf and grass patterns. They had bulging eyes that rolled to look in all directions.
Those don't look right either,
Theo said.
Nothing here is right,
Shannon said.
You must choose the best you can, and try not to ingest negative warp. There have been those who go into warp zones to hunt the energy they lack. They try to take it and make themselves stronger. It is a very old sorcerer's trick. But today, we hunt for survival. Make your choice, and let the others go with your goodwill. They will have a positive response to being prey, and will pass that energy on to their young. Thank them. Always thank them.
Theo looked at him uncertainly. Shannon gestured toward the water and then stood aside while Theo spent several minutes trying to grab a fish, unsuccessfully. Shannon showed him how to make a rope loop on his fingers, then simply drop it into the water, tighten it around the fish, and lift it out. Theo smiled at how obvious and simple that was. He used the rope, neatly snatched 5 of the fish out and laid them on the ground. Theo looked to his teacher, pleased. Shannon gestured toward the water.
Release the rest with thanks and dispel the energies.
Theo did as he was told. He had learned to shut up and obey when someone offered a new magic. Most of what he knew was learned from those who were never supposed to be teachers. What he learned in secret and in passing. He had failed his regular lessons on purpose until neither his mother nor her henchmen bothered teaching him any more. He had worked very hard to seem inept before her, and had taken a great many beatings to prove it. She ignored him now because of it, and thought of him as a waste of her time. He could not hope for more, but finding teachers of any sort was difficult, even with her attention elsewhere. To find out that Shannon was able and willing to teach was something that almost made him glad to be here. Shannon rose from the ground and let Theo pick up the fish he had caught. Without a word, the tall man led the way back to the camp. Tavia had a fire crackling warmly. Boughs were laid out to sit on. Theo held up the fish to show her, rather proud of the catch.
You catch those?
Tavia asked with a smile.
More or less,
Theo said, not denying Shannon was behind it.
Shannon showed me a trick.
What's with their eyes?
Cindy asked.
Oh, they're just that sort of fish.
Knowing his wife well enough, he lied about it to avoid another scene.
It's nothing, Cindy. They are just big-eyed river trout.
Oh, well then you may cook them now,
she told Tavia, who sighed and took the fish. Cindy beamed at the other woman's surrender to her command. She slid over for Theo to sit. He was feeling good enough, thinking of the new magic and how to apply it to other uses, that he chose to sit beside her. She snuggled up to get warm. He had to admit that her warmth was nice, so he shared his cloak with her and put his arm around her. He forgot at times that she was only 18, still a child in many ways. At heart, she was a nice girl. There was a reason he had married her. If he could just get her to accept that being nice wasn't weakness, they might be all right together. For the first time in weeks, he had not thought of Ivan or smelled him on her. She smiled and kissed his cheek. He looked over at her.
What was that for?
He asked in Owens.
You're adorable,
she said, her eyes glowing and warm. He almost smiled at that. There was so much more to Cindy than she ever showed, and it hurt him that he did not inspire her to be brave enough to show it.
You can be,
he told his young wife. She grinned and snuggled closer. He let her, draping his arm around her. His thoughts went back to the magic he had just learned, and he contemplated the many uses of it. The fish was unexpectedly good with the bones cooked away and the meat light and sweet. They ate the hot meat with relish, having no guilt about not sharing with the others who had gone on ahead. They burned their fingers a number of times, but after the cold of the last few days, the heat of the fish and the fire they were gathered around was welcome. Not even Cindy had anything but praise for the meal. They ate and rested a bit before they put the fire out. Shannon led the way from their little camp up the mountain, following the trail of the men who had left them behind. They climbed up the next steep slope and were headed down when Raven came upon them, backtracking to find them. He was relieved to find them all well, but a bit annoyed to find them in a good mood and not at all concerned for where he was. He looked at Shannon, feeling insulted by their lack of response. Shannon gave absolutely no response to the dwarf's look and kept his usual pace.
I found a track not too far from here,
Raven said.
A track?
Cindy asked.
As in a road?
Yes,
he said.
We knew there were humans this way, that's why we did the scan.
I thought the local energies were too warped for a true scan to work,
Theo said. The dwarf looked at the slender man, almost irritated at the remark. However, he was more surprised than bothered that Theo had said something.
We got enough from the scan to know to come this way.
Maybe there is a city near and we can get a real bath, and I so need to get some personal items,
Cindy said with a little giggle. Theo glanced at her but didn't say anything as they started after the dwarf. They climbed up over a low ridge and dropped down onto a narrow track. It was an old, rutted road that wound down through the mountains. It had recent signs of use. There were tracks of numerous horses in the mud, apparently from several days past, and footprints here and there in soft spots. The recent tracks were certainly from the men whom Shannon had met in the circle. Oirion and Raven could only speculate on who had caused them. They kept close watch on the ground and the tracks, but said nothing of them. By the day's end, they had made it a good ways down the mountain, and thus far had found no other sign of humans. As the sun began to rest on the horizon, they came upon an old building. It looked as though it had been burned out at some point, but had been used as a camp since then. There was a bit of wood still stacked up in the corner, and the fire ring was no more than a week old. Shannon was not with the group, and Oirion grumbled about him vanishing again. They all took time to set up the camp. Raven noticed what looked like arrow holes in the back wall of the half-burned dwelling and inspected them. After he had studied them for a moment, he suggested to Oirion that they fortify a bit, just in case they needed to stay a few days. Oirion agreed without any argument. Ivan and Dave stepped up to aid them in the gathering of fallen trees and any stones they could find. Shannon returned just after sundown. It was getting dark as the moons rose above the mountains. He had another of the deer creatures. This one was a little buck. Shannon had snapped off the horns before he brought it to them, but made no comment about it. The meat of the buck was tough and tasted bad, but they ate it anyway. They dried what they didn't eat and stashed it in their pockets and packs. No one said anything about the meal of fish they had earlier, and for once, Tavia didn't ask Shannon if he had eaten. She had the feeling that he ate better than any of them, and just didn't bother to tell. There was no way he could live on what little he ate in camp. She decided to watch more carefully for that sort of thing. Travis left his mother's side and went over to Dave. He crawled into Dave's crossed legs, snuggled in to be warm within Dave's shield, and watched as Dave worked on sharpening his dagger.
You know it's sharp,
Ivan said.
You'll shave it to nothing.
Dave looked up at the big man and smiled.
It's also spelled and needs no sharpening,
he said.
It helps me relax,
he explained with a shrug.
Don't you have something that you do before a fight to help you clear your head and not worry about it?
Ivan grunted.
I look forward to battle,
he said, folding his arms over his chest and leaning back against the wall.
That's not what I meant,
Dave said. Ivan looked grumpy about the thought of it and took a moment to respond, stretching out his legs.
I pick fights with sailors.
Dave looked up at Ivan, half smiling. Ivan held a straight face for a moment and then laughed at Dave.
I pray.
He got up chuckling about it and walked just out the doorway to piss.
You do anything to unwind?
Dave asked Raven.
I would usually smoke, but I lost my pipe to the ocean,
he said as he chewed on a twig. He tossed it aside, realizing what he was doing.
What about you?
Raven asked Kelly, trying to keep the conversation light and easy. She looked up from cleaning her fingernails and shrugged.
I like to make lace.
Cindy offered happily.
And Theo can draw well.
What about you, Shannon?
Raven asked. Shannon turned from the darkness he was watching, through what had once been a window.
He kills people,
Dave said in a cheerful tone. Shannon glanced at him, then back to the darkness.
That's not funny, Dave,
Cindy said. He responded with a shrug. The conversation dropped off, but it was a while before they were all tired enough to try to fall asleep. It was cold, and the fear of the local creatures kept them on edge, but they eventually drifted off one by one. Raven tried to stay awake and watch Shannon, but he fell asleep while Shannon still stood at the window, looking out to the north. Rose hip tea was added to the dry meat for breakfast. They drugged themselves back to their feet with the hope of finding a village before dark, and maybe more food and a bath. The old road led them down to a deserted village. It had been abandoned for some time, the buildings half-burnt and collapsing. Raven and Oirion stepped aside to do another joint scan. Then Raven chose a new direction, and they all left the derelict village behind. They climbed the ridge and followed an old wash down to another small rutted road. The wagon tracks wound down and out of the forest. It led them into an area of very poor farmland. It looked to Shannon as if the local farmers were still using wooden, single-tine plows. The plow ruts were more like little ditches than the rows of a well-tended field. He caught Tavia muttering to herself about the farms. She apparently found them rather offensive, and already blamed the local lord. Only an idiot would have his farms handled so poorly. The village was far smaller than they had hoped, but it had several shops. A few people stood about, looking at them curiously.
Why do I get the feeling we are out of place?
Dave muttered as they walked. Shannon chose a long, low building and went to the man who stood in the doorway. The man gripped a tall staff. He was blind in one eye, where a scar crossed it. Old and wizened by age, he appeared half-starved and very concerned. He bowed his head, looking at them as if expecting them to attack.
"What can I do for you?"
he asked, in a very ancient form of the continental human tongue, although altered a bit from the form Shannon had learned as a young man. With a small dose of the tainted magic that was still coursing through his veins, Shannon could understand the dialect clearly, and when he spoke, it was as if he was a local. With just a fraction more power, he could share this magic with all the others. The last thing he wanted was to have them seem like strangers. He suspected he would be doing that sort of thing for them a great deal.
We require a place to rest and wash, and some food supplies.
The man shifted a bit on his feet, uneasy of the strangers.
We have items of trade,
Shannon added, to help the man relax a little. The old fellow was clearly uneasy, but he nodded and let them into the building behind him. It was a common hall, the best and closest to an inn the small village had. He led them to the table in the back corner.
"We don't got much,"
he said.
"What do you need?"
Weapons,
Raven said, using his own magic to communicate with the man.
"No weapons. You gotta go to the Baron for that."
He looked at the dwarf, a bit startled. He looked back at Shannon.
"We got a few packs of dried goods and clothes better fit for the weather."
He eyed Cindy.
"What have you got?"
Shannon slung his pack off onto the table and dug into the bottom. He pulled out a small silk pouch. He gave Ivan a look that said to keep his items hidden. He set the little pouch down and untied the string, revealing what was inside. There was a well-cared-for collection of buckles, buttons, and fishhooks. These small items were things all of them had in their packs. Shannon, however, had added to it. He had several of the hobgoblin's teeth and a few claws of some other animal. There was a small necklace with a shell on it that he had picked up from the cave, something that Raven had discarded as junk. Shannon had, however, rewoven the cord with new sinew and added several little bone beads to it. A little old man pushed up to the table to see the items. He waved his hand over them and nodded. He picked out the teeth and the necklace, gesturing for them to sit at the table.
"What do you have need of?"
he asked.
Clothes for the weather and tools for the dwarf,
Shannon said, sitting with calm, smooth confidence. The others moved to take their seats with far less grace.
"We can see to that,"
he said.
"but you can't stay here."
He gestured to a younger man who quickly went to get the gear. He fingered the necklace he had taken. He looked up at Shannon.
"You felt the circle?"
We did,
Shannon said.
"Yes, I thought so when I heard strangers were here. It is best you go. You may stay the night, but then you go."
You do not wish allies against the trouble?
Shannon asked. The man smiled faintly.
"That would in turn only cause more trouble."
He looked them over. His eyes settled on Cindy for a moment and then on Tavia.
A pity. The last few years have been hard on the people.
He smiled at Travis, who hid behind his mother's legs, peeking at the man. He turned his attention back to Shannon.
We killed a hobgoblin in the mountains,
Raven said.
I suspect he has been part of the hardship.
The old man nodded.
He slips our best trackers, but he hasn't come around here for some time now.
Then the child was not from here?
Raven asked.
No.
The man looked troubled and a bit sickened.
Not one of ours. Not this time.
He looked back as the other man returned with a load of clothes. He laid them on the table and spread out what he had gathered. Most of it was too small for the party, but it offered clothes for the women, Theo and Travis. They chose warm wool pants and vests. There were also a few hats that Shannon passed out. He handed the only cloak to Dave and pushed the rest away.
If you've more to trade, you could go to the barony, but I'd be careful. The baron's not the most trustworthy of men, and he may try and keep your women, but he'll have weapons and more to trade.
Is there a place we can bathe?
Ravan asked, accepting a roll of leather from the man. It contained a small set of tools. The old man nodded.
There's a hot springs in the back. I'll show you.
He led them all from the open hall to a back room. Tubs lined the wall, each with its own little room. Water ran from a hot pool down pipes along the wall and poured into the tubs. He nodded and left them to the bath. After the very welcome baths, Shannon paid for their small meals with the belt buckle and a few fish hooks that were left in his pouch. They slept on the floor of the common hall, using the blankets they carried. Oirion woke to find that the embers of the tavern fire had sunk low. He crawled out of his blanket to add another log. As the light grew brighter, he noticed that both Shannon and Cindy were gone. He moved to try to find them without waking the others. He crossed the room and went out the door. He thought it was the front, but it turned out to be a side door to the backyard. He stepped out and stood a moment in the chill. He was about to turn back when he saw Cindy. He was so shocked, he stood staring in disbelief. She was naked in the cold, wearing nothing but her hair and an amulet. The amulet was radiating warmth around her. She was oblivious to the world, with her hands in her hair, as she rocked with the motion of the man beneath her. Oirion was so stunned he didn't even know what to do. She ran her hands over her body and opened her eyes. She saw him standing there and watched him as she continued with her task. He had never met a woman so bold and so open about it. He couldn't even move. He wanted to grab her and scream at her for her utter lack of morals and total lack of commitment to her marriage vows. On the other hand, he had never seen anything quite so erotic before. She rolled her eyes and arched her back, gasping with her pleasure. Oirion broke free of his shock and turned to run back inside. He ran right into Shannon, who grabbed hold of his shoulders. Oirion was out of breath and not in the mood to deal with Shannon. He almost shoved him aside when a shout rose from the village and a bell began to ring. The door was flung open from the street.
"Hobgoblins! Grab hold of your boy!"
A man roared. Shannon and Oirion both ran for the front as torches flared up. The building was lit up, and the village was full of shouting alarms and citizens armed with whatever they could grab. Oirion was right on Shannon's heels as they hit the street. Shannon grabbed a pitchfork that leaned on the wall near the back door, and Oirion snatched up the makeshift staff he had left just inside the front door. They hit the rush of green, horrid little creatures in the street outside the common hall. There were a good number of them, shrieking and scrambling all over. They were everywhere, on the buildings and in the street. Oirion shouted as one leapt from a rooftop. It had a screaming child in its arms. Shannon threw the pitchfork and sent it through the thing's legs. It fell in its run, and Shannon rushed down on it. He snagged up the toddler in one arm and crushed the hobgoblin's head with his heel. He set the toddler safely down, and jerking the pitchfork free, he sank it into another's chest and kicked a third in the face. Oirion was swarmed under for a moment and lost track of the Pertan. Raven, Dave, and Kelly were all there. They attacked together as a wall of force that broke the momentum of the hobgoblins, who clearly did not expect such skill and power. The hobgoblins turned to flee, shrieking and howling as they scattered. The warriors were not about to let them go so easily. Shannon was the first to chase after them. They were fast and could see in the dark, but so could he. Oirion was not so well off as a Purton or a dwarf in the dark, but this was what his life was, and he moved better than a human should be able to, the power of his priesthood rising to give him sight. He raced after one that he could see just ahead of him. He caught it trying to rush up a tree and jabbed the staff upward, knocking the creature off the branch. It came down with an attack and a scream. It caught Orion's shoulder with its claws and tried to bite him. But Oirion tore the thing off his arm by the scruff of its neck. He swung hard, crushing it against the tree. Unable to find any more goblins, he eventually turned and headed back down the mountain, returning to the village just as the sun began to rise. There were several buildings on fire, but he was tired from the long run and the short night, so he didn't offer any aid. He came around the building to find that most of the village people had gathered. He could see some of the others there as well. Dave moved back to Oirion.
Get any more?
Dave asked.
Just one. Is everyone back?
Shannon's not back yet. Kelly brought in several children who were stolen a few nights ago. There were knights after the goblin horde. 2 of the knights are fathers of the babies. They are rather happy about the return of their children and the fact that they are still alive. We are going to be taken to the Baron to be rewarded for our help.
Oirion nodded. Maybe God was watching over them. Thank you for listening. More chapters are available. Join our Patreon at patreon.com/2ravens801. If you enjoyed this chapter and would like to hear more, please like and subscribe to our channel. It helps more than you know.